Welcome to the deep dive. So, you've given us this really comprehensive lecture on lifespan development, all tailored for the EPPP.
That's right.
And our mission today really is to dive into that material, pull out the absolutely crucial stuff, the most interesting bits, to help everyone nail these concepts for the exam, make them stick.
Exactly. Think of it as your focused guide to the core of that lecture. We'll be covering quite a range from, well, right back at prenatal brain development up to things like divorce and loss later on.
And it's actually a bigger chunk of the EPPP than people might think, right? About 12%.
Yeah, around that. So you could be looking at, what, 20, maybe 22 questions just on lifespan?
Wow. And some, as you said in the lecture, are pretty straightforward, like Baumrine's authoritative parenting. You just need to know it.
Right. But others definitely require digging a bit deeper, like knowing Prader-Willi syndrome is often caused by a specific chromosomal deletion, not just, a generic genetic issue.
Okay, so not just surface level. Let's really dig in then. Starting right at the beginning, as you said, brain development. The lecture laid out those three prenatal stages.
Yep. First up is the germinal stage. That's
Yeah.
the first 2 weeks, basically the zygote phase.
Okay.
Then comes the embryonic stage, weeks 3 through 8. This is a really critical time. Major brain structures are forming rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, the fetal stage. That takes us from week 9 right up to birth, around 40 weeks.
It's just incredible how fast those connections form in the early years, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, by age 2, the brain's already hit about 80% of its adult weight. Think about all the learning happening.
Yeah.
And that rapid growth leads to something fascinating around age 2, synaptic pruning.
Right. Synaptic pruning, that's where the brain kind of cleans house, gets rid of unused connections.
Precisely. It's not just about adding more, it's about efficiency.
Yeah.
Strengthening the pathways that get used and letting the weaker ones go. It's like streamlining the network.
Makes
And by age 5, the brain's already about 90% of its adult size. It really shows how the brain optimizes itself. Maybe a lesson there for studying to focus on the key connections, not every single detail.
Huh, good point. And the lecture mentioned this development follows a specific pattern, kind of bottom up.
Exactly. Sensory pathways mature early on. Vision, for example, newborns see clearly, maybe 20 feet out.
Right.
But by 6 months, it's much closer to adult levels, 200, 400 feet.
Right.
Hearing is pretty good right from birth, actually, near adult sensitivity. And auditory localization develops within just days.
Wow.
Then come motor skills, language development.
And then finally, the higher order stuff, the planning, decision-making.
That's
That's
it.
the frontal lobes, right?
Exactly. And the key point from the lecture is that these frontal lobes, responsible for all that executive function, aren't fully baked until the early to mid-20s.
Which explains a lot about teenagers sometimes.
It definitely has implications. We'll touch on that with a practice question. It's also worth noting, though, that later in life, starting maybe around age 30, the brain does begin a gradual, slight shrinking.
Oh. Due to neuron loss.
Yeah, neuron loss and fewer connections. It sounds a bit worrying, but it's a natural aging process. But there's also neurogenesis.
Ah, the creation of new neurons.
Exactly. That continues throughout life in some areas. So the brain still has plasticity, which is pretty encouraging.
Okay, so back to the frontal lobes and adolescence. The lecture had a practice question about impulsivity.
Right. Why might teens be more impulsive, maybe rebellious, show poorer judgment sometimes? The lecture pointed straight to the answer. The frontal lobe.
Because, as you said, it's still under construction during those years, affecting planning, risk assessment.
Precisely those things. Decision-making, weighing consequences, all still developing. Okay, so that's the physical brain structure. How about communication, language development?
Right. The lecture outlined those typical stages. Starts with crying.
Which is communication right from the start. Then babbling, around 4 to 6 months. That first word usually pops up around 12 months.
Mm-hmm.
Then we see holophreasic speech, one word standing for a whole thought, like up, meaning pick me up.
Yeah.
And then telegraphic speech, those 2 or 3 word sentences, daddy go, want juice. Like sending a telegram, just the essentials.
And the theories trying to explain how this all happens, there were 3 main ones.
That's right. You've got the behaviorist view, Skinner, operant conditioning, language learned through rewards, punishments, reinforcement.
Okay.
Then the nativist perspective, most famously Chomsky, the idea we're born with an innate language acquisition device, or LAD, like a built-in grammar blueprint.
That idea of being pre-programmed is pretty interesting.
It is, but then there's the interactionist theory, which kind of brings nature and nurture together.
Right, a mix.
Yeah. It says, sure, there's probably some innate ability, but it develops through social interaction. The child wants to communicate, and the environment, the people around them, shape how they learn. The lecture's shoes on example fits here perfectly, learning through context and interaction.
Got it. The lecture also mentioned bilingualism. That always fascinates me.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff. Kids learning two languages might initially have a slightly smaller vocabulary in each language compared to monolingual kids.
Okay.
But their total vocabulary across both languages is often the same or even bigger. Plus, there's evidence for cognitive advantages,
Right.
maybe more mental flexibility, better inhibitory control, possibly from constantly switching between languages.
Makes sense. And the practice question tied into this about Spanish speakers and dual language programs.
Yes. And connecting back to the research, the finding is generally that they perform at least as well in English, sometimes even better, than similar students in English-only programs. So, answer D in the lecture.
Mm.
It shows bilingualism isn't a hindrance.
Good to know. Okay, moving on from language. Risk factors in development. The lecture talked about things that can go wrong, basically. Prenatal and postnatal events.
Absolutely. Things like oxygen deprivation at birth can have serious impacts. And the timing of any negative influence is really crucial. This brings up critical versus sensitive periods.
Okay, let's nail the difference. Critical period means if you don't get the right input then, the skill just won't develop properly, like the kitten vision study.
Exactly that. Hubble's work showed if a kitten's eye is closed during that critical window, the brain pathways for vision from that eye don't form correctly, and it's permanent.
Wow.
A sensitive period is more like Carrie. The brain is extra receptive, really plastic, makes it easier to learn something, form those synapses. But unlike a critical period, you can still learn the skill later. It just might be harder. Understanding these different vulnerability windows is key for the EPPP.
Right. And then there are teratogens, substances causing birth defects.
Yeah. Drugs, alcohol, certain chemicals. What's complex here is that the impact depends on several things: how much exposure, how often.
Mm-hmm.
The timing, that embryonic stage, weeks 3 to 8, is especially vulnerable for major structural problems. Even the mother's own metabolism plays a role. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, FASD, is a stark example of how devastating teratogen exposure can be.
Okay. The lecture then shifted into specific disorders, starting with genetics.
All right, just a quick review. 23 pairs of chromosomes, 22 autosome pairs, one sex chromosome pair, XX for female, XY for male. The father's sperm determines the sex.
Got it.
Then we talked about chromosomal abnormalities, problems with the number or structure of those chromosomes.
And the lecture focused mostly on autosomal ones, affecting the first 22 pairs.
Primarily, yes.
Yeah.
Like Down syndrome, which is trisomy 21, an extra copy of chromosome 21,
Mm-hmm.
leads to intellectual disability, certain physical features, risk increases with parental age, and Prader-Willi syndrome. This was highlighted for the exam, often caused by a deletion on the paternal copy of chromosome 15. Knowing that specific origin can be important. It leads to intellectual disability, obesity issues, distinct facial features, often OCD-like behaviors too.
Definitely need to keep those details straight. And then sex chromosome abnormalities.
Yes, Klinefelter's syndrome affects males. They have an extra X chromosome, XXY, can cause issues with secondary sex characteristics, often infertility.
Okay.
And Turner syndrome affects females who are missing an X chromosome, so they just have one X, XO. Often associated with shorter stature, some cognitive deficits, and issues with sexual development.
All right. Then the lecture broadened out again, looking at environmental factors, reminding us genes aren't the whole story.
Not at all. Heredity might account for, say, 50% of the variation in many traits, but that leaves a huge role for the environment, which led into Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory.
Ah, yes, the nested circles model. Can you quickly recap the layers?
Sure. At the center is the individual. Then the microsystem, the immediate environment. Family, school, friends, neighborhood.
Right.
The mesosystem is the connections between parts of the microsystem, like a parent-teacher meeting, linking home and school.
Okay.
The exosystem includes settings the person isn't directly in, but that still affect them, like a parent's stressful job impacting home life.
Makes sense.
The macrosystem is the broader culture, values, laws, customs. And finally, the chronosystem, that's the influence of time, major life events, historical changes across the lifespan.
That's a really helpful framework. Okay, let's switch gears again. Cognitive development theories. Piaget was up first.
Right. Piaget saw kids as active learners, like little scientists exploring their world. Development driven by biological maturation and interacting with the environment. Central to this is adaptation.
Which involves assimilation and accommodation.
Exactly.
Okay.
Assimilation is trying to fit new information into existing mental boxes or schemas. Accommodation is changing those boxes or making new ones when the new info doesn't fit. The classic example. A child sees a cat, calls it doggy, assimilation into the dog schema, then learns cats are different and creates a new cat schema, accommodation.
So assimilation is like jamming a new piece into an existing puzzle spot. Accommodation is reshaping the spot or finding a new one.
That's a great way to put it.
And Piaget proposed those 4 big stages, right? Universal stages.
Yep. Sensor motor, birth to about 2 years, learning through senses and actions. Big achievement here is object permanence, knowing things exist even when you can't see them.
Okay.
Then pre-operational, roughly 2 to 7. Thinking is more symbolic, but still limited by things like egocentrism, difficulty seeing things from another's perspective, and irreversibility. Concrete operational, maybe 7 to 11 or 12. Kids start thinking logically about concrete things. They grasp conservation, understanding that quantity doesn't change just because appearance does.
Right, the water glass experiment.
Exactly. And finally, formal operational. From adolescence onward, abstract thought, hypothetical reasoning, thinking about possibilities, not just reality. Also, that adolescent egocentrism kicks in the imaginary audience, personal fable.
Thinking everyone's watching them.
Yeah,
Okay, but Piaget wasn't the only game in town. Vygotsky had a different take.
very different emphasis. Vygotsky's sociocultural theory stressed the role of social interaction and culture. Learning happens between people first, then gets internalized. Language is key.
And the zone of proximal development, the ZPD.
Crucial concept. The ZPD is the gap between what a learner can do alone and what they can do with help from someone more knowledgeable, a teacher, a peer.
Okay.
And learning happens best within that zone, using scaffolding, providing just the right amount of support to help the learner bridge that gap. The statistics example in the lecture illustrated this well.
So for the EPPP, the contrast is Piaget's individual discovery versus Vygotsky's socially guided learning.
That's a core difference, yes.
And the practice question about the 18-month-old looking for mom when she leaves the room, that ties directly back to Piaget's.
Object permanence. Yep. Searching means the child understands mom still exists even when out of sight. That's sensor-motor stage stuff. So answer D.
Got it. Okay, next section in the lecture was personality development. Freud, Erikson, Levinson, the big names.
Starting with Freud's psychosexual theory. All about the libido, that psychic energy, moving through different body zones, oral, anal, phallic stages in early childhood, then latency, then the genital stage.
And fixation was key. Getting stuck.
Right. If needs were under or over-gratified at a stage, you could get fixated. Like oral fixation might lead to thumb-sucking in childhood, maybe compulsive eating or smoking later on.
Okay, Erikson offered a different view, though, more social, and across the whole lifespan.
Exactly. Erikson's psychosocial theory focused on social influences and development across 8 stages, each with a core conflict to resolve, like trust versus mistrust in infancy or identity versus role confusion in adolescence. Successfully resolving each conflict builds psychological strengths.
More optimistic, maybe. And then Levinson, seasons of a man's life.
Levinson focused on adult development, particularly in men, proposing major periods and transitions. He talked about the midlife transition, a time of reevaluation, shifting focus from time since birth to time left to live.
But his theory faced some criticism.
Yeah, mainly for being based on a small, non-diverse sample initially, and perhaps overstating the universality of stages like the midlife crisis.
Right, and the practice question linked Erikson's stage industry versus inferiority, to which of Freud's?
For Freud's latency stage. Both fall roughly in middle childhood, like ages 6 to 11 or 12. Erikson saw this time as focused on developing competence, while Freud saw it as a period where sexual urges are less dominant and energy goes into school and social stuff. So answer D again?
Okay, keeping track. Next up, moral development. Piaget again, to start.
Piaget had a 2-stage theory here. First, heteronymous morality, common in younger kids, maybe 7 to 10. Rules are seen as absolute, fixed, handed down by authority, focuses on consequences. Breaking a rule is bad. Regardless of intent, punishment should follow immediately.
Got it.
Then autonomous morality, emerging around age 11 or so. Kids understand rules or social agreements can be changed. Intentions become important in judging actions.
And Kohlberg built on this, made it more complex.
Definitely. Kohlberg developed a more elaborate stage theory based on how people reasoned about moral dilemmas, like the Heinz dilemma: should Heinz steal a drug to save his dying wife?
Right.
He proposed 3 levels, each with 2 stages. Pre-conventional level, morality based on avoiding punishment or getting rewards. Self-interest rules.
Okay.
Conventional level, Morality based on conforming to social rules, laws, maintaining order, gaining approval, doing what's expected.
Hmm.
Post-conventional level. Morality based on abstract ethical principles, universal rights, justice. Goes beyond specific laws or social conventions.
But Kohlberg's theory also got criticized for bias.
Yes, particularly by Carol Gilligan, who argued his original research, mostly on boys, emphasized a justice orientation and downplayed a care orientation, focusing on relationships and responsibility, which she found more prominent in girls' reasoning.
Interesting point. The practice question on Kohlberg was specific, the first stage of the post-conventional level.
Right. That stage involves thinking about the welfare of society, laws being social contracts that should generally be upheld, but recognizing they can be changed democratically for the greater good. That was answer D. The lecture suggested using elimination here, knowing the basics of pre-conventional and conventional helps narrow it down.
Good strategy.
Okay.
Okay, briefly, before hitting family stuff, the lecture mentioned diverse identities. How early does awareness start?
Surprisingly early. Research suggests babies can notice racial differences by 6 months, and by 3 or 4 years old, kids can usually label racial groups. Katz's studies show they also start picking up on the social meanings attached to race, like peer preferences, even if they don't grasp the full context.
Wow, that early. Okay, now into the big topic of family development, attachment parenting. Attachment theory seems central.
Absolute fundamental, that strong emotional bond between child and caregiver. You really see it developing in the second half of the first year, with things like social referencing the baby, checking the caregiver's reaction in an uncertain situation.
Mm-hmm.
The lecture mentioned Lorenz's work with goslings imprinting during a critical period, and Bowley's theory for humans, a biological drive to form attachments, leading to internal working models of relationships.
And Ainsworth's strange situation helped classify different attachment styles.
Yes, that observational procedure revealed patterns. Secure attachment, distressed when caregiver leaves, happy on return, generally linked to responsive parenting.
Okay.
Insecure avoidant, little distress on separation, ignores caregiver on return, often linked to dismissive or intrusive care.
Right.
Insecure, ambivalent, or resistant, very upset at separation, but ambivalent or angry on return, linked to inconsistent care. And disorganized, disoriented, contradictory behaviors, confusion, often associated with frightening caregiver behavior or trauma. And these patterns do predict later social and emotional functioning.
Very important. And Baumrien's parenting style is another key area for the EPPP.
Definitely need to know these. Based on warmth and control. Authoritative. High warmth, high but reasonable control. Explains rules. Best outcomes, generally kids tend to be confident, cooperative, successful.
Okay, that's the gold standard, sort of.
Pretty much. Then authoritarian. Low warmth, high control, strict rules, harsh punishment. Outcomes often more negative. Kids can be moody, withdrawn, maybe aggressive. The lecture mnemonic was N for negative and authoritarian.
Useful.
Permissive. High warmth, low control, few demands, indulgent. Kids can struggle with self-control, be impulsive,
Right.
and rejecting, neglecting. Low warmth, low control, uninvolved. Worst outcomes, kids may be hostile, detached, prone to delinquency. But remember, cultural context matters for how these styles play out.
Good point. The lecture also touched on family composition, birth order, single parents, working parents.
Yeah, birth order effects are often talked about, but research suggests they're actually pretty small overall. Maybe slight trends, firstborn slightly higher on achievement, laterborns may be more sociable or rebellious, but lots of overlap.
Okay.
Single-parent homes outcomes can vary hugely. Often challenges relate more to available resources than the structure itself. Working parents in daycare, the research is mixed. High-quality daycare might offer some cognitive or language boosts, but social-emotional effects are less clear-cut.
And TV.
Consistent finding, link between viewing violent content and aggression. Also, excessive TV viewing is linked to less reading, lower grades, less family interaction. Pretty clear negatives there.
Okay. Lastly, the lecture covered major family events like divorce and death. Divorce impact. It depends.
It really does. The first year is often toughest. A huge factor is parental conflict. More conflict, worse outcomes for kids, regardless of custody.
Makes sense.
Child's age matters too. Preschoolers might show more immediate problems. Older kids might internalize things more, affecting later views on relationships. Some studies even find a sleeper effect for some girls' problems emerging later.
Interesting. Protective factors.
Authoritative parenting from the custodial parent is huge. And contact with the non-custodial dad is generally positive, especially if conflict is low and he uses an authoritative style himself.
Okay. And death and dying Kubler-Ross.
Yes, her 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, DBTA. Important to remember, as the lecture stressed, people don't necessarily go through them in order or experience all of them. It's more of a framework.
Got it. And the final practice question was about that non-custodial father contact after divorce.
Right. And the best answer, C, highlighted that positive outcomes, especially for boys, are more likely when that contact is frequent and the father uses an authoritative parenting style. It's not just about seeing the dad, but the quality of the interaction. The tip about avoiding absolutes like always in answers is good general test advice, too.
Absolutely. Wow. Okay. We have definitely covered a lot of ground here, a real deep dive into lifespan development from, well, before birth right through to these major life events.
It's a huge field. And remember, this was just distilling the key points from that lecture you provided. We really hope listeners will go back to their notes, maybe explore some areas further. It all connects.
It really does. So maybe a final thought for everyone listening, something to mull over as they continue studying. Considering this constant dance between nature and nurture across our whole lives, what single factor, if you had to pick one, do you think has the most profound, lasting impact on who we become, and why?
It's a great question to ponder. There's no single right answer, of course, but thinking about it helps integrate all this information, keep digging into these fascinating topics, keep asking questions, and yeah, best of luck with your EPPP prep.